Welcome to the wonderful fantasy world. Subscribe now. The Mark of the Two Snakes, The Rebirth of the God, Slayer. Volume 1, The Awakening of the Blood Oath. Chapter 7, The Gear Hunters. Gigantic gear-shaped cracks split the surface of the misty wasteland. When Aiden followed Mara's caravan and entered the skeleton of a petrified giant whale, the gear-shaped walkway between the vertebrae was seeping with faint blue spiritual veins. This was the result of the energy leakage from the Eternal Silence core in the previous Divine Throne experiment. The caravan scouts had once picked up a metal piece engraved with 007 in the gear cracks, the experimental code name of Aiden's mother as Vera's vessel. Be careful of the gear meshing frequency. Mara's snake tail swept across the rusty gear chain, and the red snake's spiritual light rippled on the metal surface. Back then, Loren used the skeleton of a giant whale for experiments. These gears will remember the heartbeat of intruders. Hardly had she finished speaking when the gear set above suddenly reversed. Aiden's blood, red eyes caught 3 cracks spreading on the gear surface, and the sound of gear shattering, which foreshadowed death, came from the tunnel ahead. The gear door at the end of the tunnel opened with a bang. Amid the sound of metal friction, a figure wearing a crow-headed mask stepped onto the gears. The frequency emitted when her mechanical eye rotated was exactly the same as the Divine Throne startup sound Aiden heard in the church's secret chamber. The gear-rubbing sound of Loren's mechanical prosthesis during the showdown of the two snakes in Chapter 8 of the Prequel. Descendant of the God, Slayer. A hoarse voice spilled out from behind the beaked mask. The pattern of 2 snakes entwining a gear on the tip of the Holy Spear suddenly glowed. The Holy Radiance Church has offered a reward for your head, to be plated on the base of the Divine Throne with gear spell imprints. Aiden noticed that the mechanical bones exposed from the gaps in her armor were exactly the gear structure that Loren's body showed after being eroded by spiritual veins in Chapter 5 of the Prequel. Aiden's blood-red eyes activated automatically. He saw the number Eternal Silence 09 engraved on the gear chain where her heart was located. It was the number of the first batch of church knights who underwent mechanical transformation in the previous Divine Throne experiment. It was the number of the first batch of church knights who underwent mechanical transformation in the previous Divine Throne experiments. 09, engraved on the gear chain where her heart was located. It was the number of the first batch of the first batch of transformation in the previous. When the Holy Spear stabbed at him, his vision suddenly superimposed with the battle afterimage from Chapter 8 of the Prequel. Vera's snake-headed sword intersected with Loren's gear sword, and the energy aftershock engraved the mark of the 2 snakes on the core of the Divine Throne. You're using Loren's Godslayer spear technique. Aiden sidestepped to avoid the spear tip. In the sparks from the collision between his wrench and the Holy Spear, he saw the manufacturing date on the inner side of her armor. The 17th year of the Eternal Silence disaster, exactly the batch of church weapon improvements after the Eternal Silence in the Misty Wasteland in Chapter 7 of the Prequel. Mara's snake tail suddenly lashed at the gear set, and the red snake spiritual light shattered the aiming gear of the opponent. She's Selene, the silver snake hunter of the Holy Radiance Knights. Mara's voice was full of vigilance. The church has transformed her with Loren's mechanical eye technology. Aiden then noticed that the iris of her mechanical eye was actually a miniaturized pattern of the Divine Throne core, exactly the same as the totem in the church's secret chamber in Chapter 10 of the Prequel. Selene's Holy Spear suddenly transformed, and the barrel unfolded into a gear-shaped siphon device, a miniaturized weapon of the spiritual vein siphon cannon in the previous Divine Throne experiment. Aiden's blood, red eyes caught the blood, colored patterns inside the barrel. The energy trajectory when Vera's spiritual veins were extracted during the church's raid in Chapter 4 of the Prequel. Your grandfather used this move to drain the spiritual veins of the Snake Tribe settlement back then. His voice was mixed with the low chant of turning gears. When the siphon beam of the Holy Spear swept across the skeleton of the giant whale, the sacrificed patterns of the previous Divine Throne experiment suddenly emerged on the petrified fish meat. Aiden suddenly remembered that the base of the Divine Throne he saw in the church's secret chamber in Chapter 3 was carved from the spine of the giant whale. When the beam was about to reach the caravan, he tightly grasped the wrench left by his father, and the red snake's spiritual light outlined the symbiosis incantation from Chapter 2 of the prequel on the gear surface. Your blood, ... Selene's mechanical jaw made a harsh rubbing sound, and her mechanical eyes suddenly burst into a strong light. It has the same spiritual vein frequency as the one Vera injected in the Divine Throne back then. Taking the opportunity, Aiden got closer and found that Volo 1 was engraved on the bearing of her mechanical eye, the number of the first human mechanical transformant in the previous Divine Throne experiment. The battle unfolded on the gear walkway. Every step triggered gear traps of different frequencies. The tip of Selene's spear could always anticipate Aiden's movements until he saw the omen of her death in the vision of his blood, red eyes. The gear chain would disintegrate in 17 seconds, and the crack was exactly at the energy interface of the mechanical eye. You're parasitized by Loren's consciousness, Aiden suddenly spoke. The moment his wrench hit her shoulder armor, he glimpsed the gear brand on the back of her neck, the mark of the contract between the Church and Loren in Chapter 10 of the prequel. Selene's attack rhythm suddenly became disordered. Aiden took the opportunity to jam the gear joint of the Holy Spear with his wrench. Amid the sound of metal friction, a fragmented memory flooded into his mind. At the top of the gear Divine Throne in Chapter 5 of the prequel, Loren pressed the mechanical eye into Selene's eye socket. Gear lubricant mixed with her blood dripped and formed a pattern of two snakes entwining on the ground. He said the aliens must be purified, ... double quotes. Selene's voice cracked for the first time, and the projection of the Divine Throne core in her mechanical eyes suddenly distorted. But I've seen in the gear prison human children whose spiritual veins were extracted. Their eyes were as red as yours. Aiden's blood, red eyes clearly saw that what flashed in her memory was exactly the alien youth saved in Chapter 3. Mara's red snake pottery cup suddenly resonated, and the blood pattern at the bottom of the cup and Aiden's mark glowed synchronously. He realized that the key to the previous Divine Throne experiment was hidden in Selene's mechanical heart. The fragmented consciousness of Loren was controlling her through the gear spell imprints. When the Holy Spear stabbed again, Aiden didn't dodge but pressed his palm on the gear core on her chest. The moment the blood-colored spiritual light poured in, Selene's mechanical jaw opened and Loren's mechanical voice spilled out. Do you think you can shake the order of the gears with pity? But Aiden saw a deeper scene. During the decisive battle in Chapter 8 of the prequel, Loren injected the fragmented consciousness into the Church Knights before the collapse of the Divine Throne, and Selene was the 13th vessel. Back then, you and Vera created the mark of the two snakes together, not to become gods. Aiden's voice was mixed with the beeping of overloaded gears. The symbiosis formula you engraved in the core of the gears is hidden on the inner side of every piece of Church armor. He remembered the Church's raid plan he saw in the black market in Chapter 5. The double snake tattoo in the signatory column was exactly the same as Selene's gear brand. Selene's mechanical eyes suddenly went out, and the Holy Spear clanged to the ground. When Aiden picked up the beacon, he found that the mechanical gear emblem in the center was absorbing the light from his blood, red eyes, and gradually revealing the star map of the previous Divine Throne experiment, the sealing relief in the Eternal Silence Core's secret chamber in Chapter 6 of the prequel. They've rebuilt the Eternal Silence Core underground in the Divine Palace. Selene knelt on the ground, and red snake spiritual light seeped out from the cracks in her mechanical arm. Using alien spiritual veins to create new Divine Throne vessels, ... She tore off the crow-headed mask, revealing the number B-74 on her mechanical lower jaw. The 74th survivor that Aiden's father had risked his life to protect in the previous Divine Throne experiment. Aiden's blood-red eyes suddenly penetrated the tunnel, seeing that the gear warships 3 kilometers away were positioning their spiritual vein fluctuations. On the armors of those warships, the names of the aliens devoured in the previous Divine Throne experiment were densely engraved, corresponding one by one to the snake-shaped birthmark on the back of the youth on the gallows in Chapter 3. Take her with us? Mara's snake tail rolled up Selene. The totem on the surface of the pottery cup and the gear brand on the other side had a repulsive reaction. There's a key to the Divine Palace in her mechanical heart. Aiden noticed that although Selene's mechanical eye was damaged, it pointed deep into the misty wasteland as the gears turned. the location of the ancient tree where Vera was petrified in Chapter 9 of the prequel. When the caravan left the skeleton of the giant whale, Aiden stroked the double snake gear on the beacon and suddenly heard the sigh of the remnant soul Vera in the jade pendant. Loren's gears hide the fear he dare not speak of. He remembered the base of the divine throne he saw in the church's secret chamber in Chapter 3. Under the pattern of two snakes entwining, there were faintly engraved alien ancient words, "Forgive us." The number 1205 that Selene murmured in her coma was exactly the date when Vera was imprisoned in the previous divine throne experiment. Aiden put the beacon fragments into the tool bag left by his father and found a half-gear hidden in the inner hidden pocket, the broken piece of Vera's snake-headed sword when the two snakes clashed in Chapter 8 of the prequel. The edge was still congealed with Loren's gear, like tears. The gray mist flowed through the cracks of the skeleton. Aiden's blood-red eyes saw that the omen of Selene's death was weakening. Deep in the hearts of those gear transformers who were once regarded by the church as perfect weapons, there was a glimmer of spiritual veins that had not been devoured, just as recorded in the log of the previous divine throne experiment. The blood of the red snake and the silver snake will eventually meet again in the cracks of the gears. The gear door at the end of the walkway suddenly opened, and the moonlight illuminated the dense gear graduations behind the door, the frequencies of alien spiritual veins recorded in the previous divine throne experiment. Aiden knew that Selene brought not only the pursuit, but also the key to the core of the divine palace, and those names engraved on the gears would eventually become the epitaph of the church's lives. Mara suddenly pressed his shoulder and rolled up the beacon fragments with her snake tail and threw them into the mist. The sound of the church fleet's gears is at 3 o'clock. They're using the silver snake tracking technique from the previous divine throne experiment. Aiden nodded. The gear cracks emerging in his blood, red eyes were guiding them on the way to the mechanical divine palace, where Loren's mechanical heart was hidden, and also the truth about his mother's death. When Selene woke up in the caravan's temporary camp, she stared at the double snake mark on Aiden's wrist. As her mechanical jaw opened and closed, a whisper leaked out. When your mother was burned, the rotation frequency of the gear torture rack was the same as the heartbeat of the divine throne core. These words were like a rusty gear suddenly turning, pulling Aiden back to the memory of Chapter 1. The sound of the gear torture device before his mother's death was synchronized with his heartbeat at this moment. Deep in the skeleton of the giant whale, a certain gear suddenly emitted a clear resonance. Aiden knew that it was the war puppet his father had built in the misty wasteland waking up. The gear on its chest was engraved with the same symbiosis formula as Selene's mechanical heart. And what awaited him ahead was not only the church's pursuit, but also the true awakening of the mark of the two snakes between the gears and the spiritual veins. This episode ends here. The next episode will be more exciting. Subscribe now.